Are you ready to uncover the darkest secrets of antiquity? Today, we will delve deeply into the gnosis of the most cruel gods venerated by the ancient Canaanites. These gods, feared and respected, left a legacy of terror and mystery that still echoes today. The Canaanites, a civilization that inhabited the region of Canaan, worshipped deities that were neither compassionate nor merciful. These entities demanded sacrifices and ruled their followers with brutal power. Over time, these deities were associated with demonology, seen as malevolent forces. The worship of these gods involved bloody rituals and esoteric practices, aimed at appeasing their wrath and gaining their favor at an extremely high cost. Today, we will uncover these hidden secrets, exploring the terrifying legends and truths about these Canaanite deities. Who were these gods? What kind of power did they wield over their followers? And what lessons can we learn from their dark and mysterious cults? Prepare for a journey into the heart of the most sinister esotericism. Each revelation will take us deeper into the mind and soul of the ancient Canaanites, unveiling knowledge that challenges our modern understanding. Let's begin. Moloch, the fearsome god of child sacrifice. Imagine a dark and mysterious valley on the outskirts of Jerusalem. In this place, known as the Valley of Ben Hinnom, the ancient Canaanites performed rituals that seem unimaginable today. Horrific sacrifices in honor of a feared and revered god named Moloch. Moloch, mentioned in the Bible as a god to whom human sacrifices were made, is a figure shrouded in mystery and horror. Although his name resonates in sacred texts, archaeological records shed little light on him. Moloch, whose name likely derives from the Hebrew word melech, king, was a figure of dark power. For a long time, it was thought that Moloch was another name for Milcom, the Ammonite deity, but more recent research suggests that Moloch could have been a title or epithet rather than a proper name. Like other cultures in the region, the ancient Canaanites referred to their gods as kings of various domains. An example is Malkandros, another name for El, the chief god of the Canaanite pantheon, meaning king of man. An intriguing theory suggests that Moloch could have been Baal-Hadad or Hadad, the king of the Canaanite gods. In the same valley where children were sacrificed, the prophet Jeremiah mentions altars dedicated to Baal, and Assyrian texts speak of child sacrifices to Hadad, the Assyrian equivalent of Hadad. This suggests a mysterious and dark connection between these gods and human sacrifices. Sacrifices in honor of Moloch were known as passing through the fire. They were performed in a sanctuary called Tophet, just outside the walls of Jerusalem. Although some believe that this practice was introduced with foreign deities, it is also possible that the ancient Jews believed they were sacrificing to Yahweh. Regardless of the intention, the biblical prophets harshly condemned these rituals, seeing them as an abomination in the eyes of Yahweh. These rituals were not exclusive to Canaan. Similar sacrifices were performed in Carthage, a city founded by Phoenician settlers. A sacred grove and a temple were dedicated to these rites, suggesting a cultural connection between Canaanite and Carthaginian practices. Although some experts debate this connection, the similarities are undeniable. A fierce aspect of the worship of Moloch is its association with bull torture, an infamous method of execution known as the brazen bull used in Sicily. This device, a bronze statue in the shape of a bull, was used to torture and kill victims. People were locked inside the hollow bull and a fire was lit underneath, heating the metal until the victims were literally roasted. The agony resonated through tubes in the bull's head, creating a sound similar to the bellowing of an enraged bull. Today, Moloch remains a figure of fascination and fear. Some theories suggest that certain elites worship this deity in the modern era. It is said that influential figures worship Moloch in secret circles. The Bohemian Club, for instance, has been the target of numerous conspiracy theories about the modern worship of Moloch. Rumors claim that the most influential people gather to commit atrocities in the name of this god, seeking power, money, and fame. Among the purported members of this club are Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon, among other high-ranking government officials and Hollywood stars. If you want to learn more about these theories and the possible contemporary worship of Moloch, research the Bohemian Club and the horrors said to occur there. If you are interested in this topic, we might make a video about it in the future. Now, let's move on to the next god. Mot, the god of death and the underworld. Mot, also known as Math, is the god of death and the underworld in Canaanite mythology. He represents an inevitable and relentless force, a constant reminder of the fragility of life and the certainty of death. His dominion over the underworld and his voracious appetite make him a feared and respected figure by both gods and humans. He is often described with a grotesque and terrifying appearance, fitting his role as the god of death. Imagine a tall, skeletal figure with dry, shriveled skin stretched over his prominent bones. His face is a mask of terror, with sunken eyes that seem like bottomless pits and a disproportionately large mouth, always open, displaying rows of sharp teeth like blades. His hair is tangled and dirty, and his presence exudes the stench of rot and decay. Stories depict him with bony hands and long claws, capable of grasping and devouring anyone who crosses his path. His appearance reflects his greedy nature and his role as a devourer of souls. He is described as a hungry god, always voracious and never satisfied, a characteristic that makes him a brutal representation of death, a power that consumes indiscriminately, affecting everyone equally. Mot not only devours humans, but also other gods, highlighting his power and ruthless cruelty. His insatiable hunger symbolizes the inevitability of death, a fate from which no one can escape. The most famous myth involving Mot is his confrontation with Baal, the god of storms and fertility. In this tale, Mot challenges Baal and drags him into the underworld, causing droughts and disasters on earth. The battle between Baal and Mot represents the eternal cycle of life and death, fertility and desolation. Although Baal eventually resurrects, the presence of Mot ensures that death always has its place in the cycle of existence. Mot is not just a god of death, but also a figure representing the underworld, a dark realm where the souls of the dead reside. His abode is a feared place, full of shadows and terror, where spirits find restless peace under his rule. This underworld reflects the Canaanite perception of death, inevitable, unfathomable, and eternally hungry. The cruelty of this god extends beyond his insatiable hunger. In some stories, he is described as reveling in the suffering of both the living and the dead, delighting in the despair his presence provokes. His pitiless nature and lack of mercy make him one of the most feared figures in the Canaanite pantheon. In ceremonies and rituals, the ancient Canaanites sought to appease Mot, to avoid his wrath and protect themselves from his voracity. With his unyielding dominion over death and the underworld, he personifies the harshness of existence and the certainty of the end that we all face. His story and cult reflect the deep fear and reverence that the ancient Canaanites felt for the relentless power of death. Baal, the lord of storms and fertility. Baal, one of the most prominent deities in the Canaanite pantheon, was essential to the lives of the ancient people of the region. Associated with storms, fertility, and agriculture, Baal was worshipped for his ability to provide rain and ensure the fertility of the land. The Canaanites, dependent on the seasons and harvests, viewed Baal as a protector and provider, ensuring the continuity of life through his blessings. Baal's influence extended beyond Canaan, being revered in neighboring cultures of the ancient Near East. His name, which means lord or owner, reflects his authority and power over natural elements. Inscriptions and artifacts found in archaeological sites demonstrate his prominence and the devotion he received. However, the worship of this god was not without brutal and fearsome practices. In times of drought, natural disasters, or calamities, the rituals dedicated to Baal could become incredibly cruel. To appease his wrath and secure his favor, human sacrifices were performed, a practice that reveals the dark and relentless side of his cult. These sacrifices were seen as necessary to restore balance and obtain the god's blessings. One of the darkest aspects of the worship of this god is the practice of child sacrifices. In desperate times, the Canaanites sacrificed their children, hoping that Baal would respond to their pleas and bring the much-needed rain. This act was seen as a last resort to save the community from famine and death. The brutality of these rituals is documented in several ancient texts, being harshly criticized in the Bible, where Hebrew prophets condemn the worship of Baal and its practices. Despite this, the cult of Baal persisted for centuries, showing the profound influence and fear that this deity inspired in his worshippers. Baal was also connected to other aspects of Canaanite life. His role as a god of fertility meant that he controlled the rains and the fecundity of animals and humans. Festivals and rituals in his honor included celebrations to thank him for his gifts and request the continuation of his favor. Beyond his importance. In ancient Canaan, Baal also left a mark in demonology. In medieval Christian tradition, he was demonized and transformed into an infernal figure. In demonological texts, he is depicted as a high-ranking demon in hell, a grotesque and monstrous entity that rules with cruelty. He is described with multiple heads, sometimes of a man, bull, and ram, symbolizing his power and fearsome nature. This transformation of Baal from a revered god to a terrifying demon reflects how later cultures interpreted and condemned the religious practices of their predecessors. Resheph, the god of plague and war. Resheph, a feared deity in the Canaanite pantheon, is the god of plague and war. His name evokes images of disease and destruction, and his presence is synonymous with death and chaos. Unlike other gods who could bring blessings and prosperity, Resheph is seen as an unstoppable and relentless force whose purpose is to sow terror and desolation. This god is often depicted as a fierce and terrifying warrior. Imagine a tall and robust figure with powerful muscles reflecting his strength in combat. His skin is pale, almost translucent, as if he is permanently in the shadow of death. His eyes, burning and penetrating, seem to reflect the fire of fever and the fury of war. His hair appears in flames in some representations, suggesting his connection with destruction and fire. His face is marked by a relentless and severe expression, devoid of compassion or mercy. He is often shown with a crown of snakes wrapped around his head, symbolizing the poison and mortality he brings. His large and strong hands hold a bow and arrows, tools of his power to unleash disease and death from a distance. The arrows, often described as poisoned, represent the rapid and painful spread of plague. The cruelty of Resheph is manifested in his association with pestilence and war, two of the most destructive and feared forces of the ancient world. It was believed that Resheph had the power to unleash devastating epidemics, wiping out entire communities with uncontrollable diseases. The plagues brought by Resheph were seen as divine punishments, and their impact was both physical and psychological, as the mere mention of his name could instill panic and despair. He was also a god of war, reveling in bloodshed and destruction on the battlefield. Warriors invoked his name for strength and ferocity, but also feared his wrath, as his favor was as volatile as it was deadly. War under the banner of Resheph not only meant the defeat of the enemy, but also the spread of disease among the survivors, prolonging suffering and agony long after the battles ended. In times of plague, the rituals dedicated to this god were particularly dark and frightening. The Canaanites performed sacrifices, often of animals and occasionally humans, to appease the god and plead for the end of the plague. These sacrifices were bloody and desperate, reflecting the powerlessness of people in the face of the destructive power of this deity. The shedding of blood in his honor was seen as an attempt to quench his insatiable thirst for destruction and death. The brutality of Resheph is amplified by his connection with other deities of war and plague in different cultures of the ancient Near East. His name appears in Egyptian texts, where he is identified with similar gods like Seth, and in Ugaritic inscriptions, highlighting his role as a bringer of calamities. His presence in these cultures underscores his reputation as an unrelenting force of devastation, whose influence extended beyond the borders of Canaan. Resheph personifies the cruelty and unpredictability of plagues and war. His grotesque figure and his association with disease and death make him a feared and respected deity, a constant reminder of the fragility of life and the relentless power of nature. The ancient Canaanites sought to protect themselves from his wrath through rituals and sacrifices, always aware that Resheph's shadow could fall upon them at any moment. Anat, the bloodthirsty warrior goddess. Anat, also known as Anath, is a warrior goddess in Canaanite mythology, known for her fierce nature and association with war. As the sister of Baal, she shared his power and presence in the Canaanite pantheon, but she stood out for her brutality and bloodlust. Anat was a protector and a deity who embodied violence and destruction in its purest form. This figure is depicted as strong and majestic, with a terrifying beauty that reflects both her power and ferocity. She is often shown armed with a spear and a bow, ready for combat. Her body is adorned with armor and war jewelry, and her intense gaze reveals her relentless determination. In some representations, Anat wears a crown of horns, symbolizing her divine status and connection to strength and the wild. The cruelty of Anat is highlighted in numerous myths that narrate her feats on the battlefield. One of the most famous stories describes how Anat, in a rage, massacres a large number of enemies. In this myth, her thirst for vengeance is so great that she does not stop until all her adversaries lie dead at her feet. Anat is not content with just victory, but also decorates her temple with the remains of her enemies, using their heads and limbs as macabre trophies. This act of ritualized violence not only demonstrates her power, but also her pleasure in destruction and chaos. Anat embodies the brutality of ancient warfare. Her insatiable bloodlust and her ability to mercilessly annihilate her enemies make her a feared and respected goddess. In Canaanite myths, she is often described as bathing in the blood of her enemies, a ritual that symbolizes her purification and readiness for future battles. This image of Anat bathed in blood highlights her bloodthirsty nature and her role as a war goddess. In another story, Anat descends to the underworld to rescue her brother Baal, showing her bravery and willingness to face any danger to protect her family. During this mission, Anat confronts and defeats the guardians of the underworld, once again demonstrating her lethal skill and unbreakable determination. Her influence extended beyond the battlefield. As a warrior goddess, she was also invoked to protect cities and their inhabitants. Sacrifices were made in her honor to ensure her favor and protection in times of war. These rituals, often bloody, reflected the need to appease her violent nature and secure her support. Anat's ferocity and her role as a war goddess left an indelible mark on Canaanite mythology. Her figure, feared and revered, symbolizes the duality of war, protection and destruction, power and cruelty.